Okay. Good evening and welcome to the 2012 Untitled Jensen lecture. Our President, Donald, is not able to be with us. So I'm going to read his welcome note. So, not that I'm perfectly reading. Ben says it's great to see many of you here tonight, and to the 20 or 30 or maybe 40 other people who are attending our lecture this evening via webinar. And so we'd like everyone to sit back and enjoy the lecture. Jensen was a scientist, and I'll just give you a bit of a background of Harold Jensen. He was a scientist who worked in many fields, and at one stage stood for election in the Australian federal government. Jensen made a significant contribution to soil science research in Australia and internationally through his work at the New South Wales Department of Agriculture and the publication of Soils of New South Wales in 1914. This work began to formalise our understanding of soil classification through the incorporation of soil chemical properties, geological features and zonality, rather than earlier the systems based on colour, landform and native vegetation. And this was a significant change in thinking. The Harold Jensen lecture is in honour of an individual who has made a significant contribution to soil science. Tonight we honour Dr. Mark Conyers. Mark joined New South Wales Agriculture in 1985 and has undertaken research in the mixed farming zone of southern New South Wales. His research initially focused on acidic soils and has now branched into both traditional soil fertility, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and into environmental issues, carbon and salinity. Mark has made significant contributions to our understanding of the soil fertility and acidity. Tonight, Mark will present a lecture entitled Particulates versus Partisans, Humus versus Rotten, Charcoal versus the Cooked. Please welcome Mark to the stage.
Thank you for the opportunity to annoy so many people at once. It's going to be a real pleasure. There have been many political drivers that have benefited soil science in South Wales. The New South Wales Soil Conservation Act of 1938 was probably the most righteous cause of all, something that was dear to the hearts of many people and was without question something that everybody supported. I've disappeared off the screen. Salinity of both soil and water remains a serious concern. We might remember that a few years ago 30% of our inland waterways were going to be undrinkable by 2020, and by 2050 we all faced the saline doom. However, even linear extrapolation couldn't save Deck W from severe budget cuts and large-scale losses of staff. Then came the chemical time bomb of soil acidity that was going to leave us with crop and pasture species. It was a concern that spawned acid soil action from 1997 to 2003. It also spawned a large number of government reports, both state and national. The acidification rates around New South Wales and across Australia were duly documented. We might skip that for time. And the acidification rates range from about 0 to about 0.1 pH per year. In limestone equivalents, about 50 to 200 kilograms per hectare per year of lime equivalent. That means it takes from 5 to 20 years for for the acidification to equal 1 tonne per hectare of lime. Kaboom? My concept of a bomb was a little bit more dramatic. The biggest explosion, of course, was when the Minister announced that acid soil action was going to end next week and about 30 people lost their jobs. That was the kaboom. Not only did we lose jobs, we lost most of the data. Recently, P's back on the agenda for GRDC and MLA. And I believe peak topsoil was in the headlines recently, but at Wagga Wagga we don't hear much of the news. Most of us can't read down there. The decisions that we make seem to be needed to get adequate funding. But what happens when the water remains drinkable? The ground doesn't turn white with salt. The acid bomb doesn't go off. The rock phosphate suddenly appears from Morocco and from New Guinea. Do we claim success? Or maybe do we admit that perhaps some of the claims were a little bit overstated? Have righteous causes largely degenerated into funding bandwagons because us dollar-starved public sector scientists go into feeding frenzies whenever there's something that looks like it might give us a bit of money? My concern is that this current one might come back to bite us badly. Now we have soil carbon. Storing carbon in the soil as organic matter is going to decrease the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, compensating for the use of fossil fuels, coal, oil, gas. Compensate for clearing the Amazon, the Congo, Southeast Asia. Anyone else getting nervous about this? Yeah, I'm getting a bit nervous. And soon we're going to have a carbon trading scheme, and it might include a substantial component of agriculture. So, 3 stepwise questions for the people in the room. Now, Todd, I have to click that button. Good. 3 stepwise questions. Don't feel shy. I mean, we will all be embarrassed. I'm the one who's standing up here asking boosty questions. How many of you believe that soil carbon sequestration can ameliorate a significant proportion of global warming? Yes, no.
Maybe? No.
We knew there'd be people like you in the room. That's why we wanted a yes-no answer.
It's possible. No, thanks.
It's possible. Okay.
Are you assuming increased CO2 relates to global warming?
That's the next one. Very good. This man's clever. Todd, are we okay to get on to the next question? What about that soil carbon sequestration can have a significant impact on atmospheric CO2? Yes, no? Yes. That's interesting. Interesting. Okay. Third question. How many people believe that we can measure soil organic carbon with sufficient accuracy to put a dollar value on it? Okay. It looks like I have an educated audience here.
It's possible. It's not that it's impossible.
No, that's quite right. Now, if I were a senior public sector official managing this, I'd don my grey or black pants, I'd put on my navy blue or my red jumper with a tie that didn't match. It was called power dressing for those of you from back in the 90s. And I'd utter the magic incantation that's always used by managers when faced with the need for deep thinking. And that is, at the end of the day, in the absence of blue sky on the horizon, the elephant in the room picks low-hanging fruit. And we'd all think they were wonderful managers. We'd then be led to realise that the problem was merely one of perception anyway, and that Bennett's hierarchy clearly reveals that vertical integration of all stakeholders leads to a clear paradigm shift, and that therefore no resolution or course of action was actually required. So we'd all sit there politely, yes, okay, I understood that. But as a senior public sector scientist, I have a moral issue. On one hand, we're trained to find the facts and report them without fear or favour. On the other hand, I need my funding, or I disappear. I need my funding and my papers, or my grading slips. And at my level, I need lots of publications and lots of money. Some old Greek decided that science should be defined as the theoretical perception of truth as opposed to moral conviction. I'm going to have to move my screen, aren't I? Some of you can't see that. Sorry, don't know what to do, but you can see my Greek statue. But my moral conviction is that there should be science-based truth and that it should dominate personal interest. But nor am I into health. I'm not talking about plagiarism or falsification of data. It's that grey area of scientific compromise for political and financial expediency that concerns me. One group, who for legal reasons I'll term the Alliance, and one dark lord, who we'll call Dr. Smith, have created a lot of hype and hope about soil carbon. I might read this in case some of you can't see it, and also for the sake of the recording. The company has been recognised as the world leader in representing farmers' interest in and educating farmers about carbon farming issues. It has been acknowledged by the CSIRO's senior soil carbon scientist, Dr. Jeff Baldock, for playing a key role in securing the $20 million funding for Australia's soil carbon program, which was augmented with additional funding under the government's $46 million carbon farming initiative. Next, Tom. The CFA single-handedly barnstormed the issue onto the national agenda. Do we blame them for the situation? Do we thank them for all the money that's flowing into soil carbon research? Can I sit back and say, well, I'm on high moral ground, I didn't do that, it's not my fault. And I'm sitting here with millions of dollars of research funding thanks to them on an issue I don't really believe I'm going to make a contribution to. Was I too silent? I know Jeff Baldock was the only poor guy who used to turn up at these sort of meetings and stand there and say, well, sorry, but we can't measure carbon that accurately, and no, it won't increase quite so rapidly. People like me didn't show up. I wasn't interested. What do the general public think about scientists? Are we seen as self-serving alarmists like the climate change scientists? They got a bit of a caning. There's a few other branches of science been getting a caning too. I've been involved in a few long-term trials in which carbon measurements have been made. Two of them I've been involved with for about 20 years. I'd like to walk through some of the data on soil carbon and show you some of the key findings and some of the frustrations that I've faced. This is data from a very well fertilised annual pasture. Bottom axis, as you can see, is years from 1992. Vertical axis is organic carbon in the soil. 15 kilograms of P per hectare per year, 15 kilograms of sulphur per hectare per year, 30 to 40% carbon, clover, subclover in the pasture. Ripper of a pasture, 25 DSE if that means anything to anybody. What I'd like you to note is the slow upward trend in these points. These are two treatments at the 0 to 10 centimetre depth. The carbon is increasing steadily. I'd also like you to note some year-to-year spikes. It's not a smooth trend. There is year-to-year variation in these spikes. I'd also like you to notice the bottom two lines, 10 to 15 and 15 to 20 centimetres. I don't think you'll see much happening. Despite the increases at 0 to 10 centimetres, there's not a lot happening below 10 centimetres over 18 years. Now here's the great hope, the perennial pasture. This is what's going to save us apparently. It's going to sequester massive amounts of organic carbon. You'll note the same slow upward trend. You'll notice that these spikes from year to year are even larger. The upward trend is encouraging. It's 500 kilograms of carbon per hectare per year, which is good. it's not a 3 to 5-fold doubling of soil carbon inside 10 years, as is persistently claimed by those telling us that we're going to make a big difference to the world carbon budget. Now let's contrast that with some cropping situations. The trial started in 1979. You can see where I joined the trial. Suddenly an increased frequency of measurements. I'm just going to show you 4 of the 13 treatments. Now I'd like you to note this trial is at 540 millimetres annual average rainfall. The 2 black symbols that you see there are treatments where the stubble is burnt, so black for ash. Simple to remember, the black treatments. You'll notice the black treatments, there is a very slow downward trend over the 20 years, actually 25 years. Small year-to-year effects, which I'll discuss in a moment. The open symbols are treatments where stubble has been retained. There is a small positive upward trend, but very large year-to-year effects. Not surprising for those of you who have ever lived in the bush and you know it rains one year and doesn't rain the next, and one year you'll get 10 tonnes of grain and the next year you'll get nothing. That's the reality of agriculture. The trend lines that the statisticians fit through that range from plus 200 kilograms of carbon per hectare per year to minus 200 kilograms of carbon per hectare per year. A similar trial was done at Condobolin, that's northwest of Wagga, 430 millimetres average annual rainfall, so about 110 mils drier. For those of you interested, Patel and Gill of the trial at Condobolin, they found no difference between all the goodies, stubble retained, direct drill, conventional tillage, 3 cultivations of offset discs, and stubble burnt. No difference over 15 years. Let's go across to Cowra, 630 millimetres. Brian Murphy, I know you're here somewhere. Brian, on the other hand, in higher rainfall environments, got a positive result from stubble retained direct drilling. In fact, Brian and Truck and Pack did a very good little review of this on pages 298 to 299 of Charman and Murphy's wonderful text from the year 2000. I reread it before. There is a big difference between trials. Higher rainfall areas, there is a small difference between these carbon management treatments. Low rainfall, low production systems, there's not much in it. Why the big year effects? Obviously, what I'm getting at here is that there are shoot and root residues each year. Burning only removes a proportion of the shoot residues. It doesn't move all the residues out of the way, and it doesn't touch the roots. So what we have here from year to year is what we call particulates. What are particulates? Well, currently in Australia we use either a 53 or 50 micron sieve, because that's the bottom of the sand size fraction. Some of the Europeans are using Madgen's 400 micron definition for particulates because they're the particles that produce big peaks of CO2 when you incubate them with soil, so they're biologically labile. Here's another example. This is the trend in soil organic carbon over 12 months. This is a loosened pasture. This is Geology in southern New South Wales. The carbon starts in January at 1.55% carbon. It trickles down during the course of the year to 1.34%. This was 2009. Then the dry sets in, early end of season. Plant starts to dry off, all the roots start to decompose, the shoots fall down, and our soil carbon climbed to 1.68%. If I was Julia, by the way, this is a bit of an aside, I'd take my first carbon measurements there, and I'd come back in a few years' time and I'd take my next lot of carbon measurements there. All these farmers are actually getting rid of carbon, or I'm going to tax the bastards. Where did you say this talk was being broadcast? It's just Armadale, isn't it? That'll be right. I've got another example here from Yass. This is a more perennial environment. Some of you might know where Yass is, whereas Georgia is down near Mexico. Most of you wouldn't have ever visited the place. We start at 1.73% carbon. During the course of the year, it trickles down to 1.48% carbon, dies, and suddenly we're at 1.78% carbon, almost exactly where we were at the beginning of the year, so you'd never know there'd been a change. Can we overcome this problem of year-to-year variation and variation in carbon within years? Well, only partly. Obviously, we can try and remove particulates from the soil sample, that is all the roots, even though we can't see them half the time. The surface detritus, yes, we can get rid of most of that. But there's a couple of problems. One, it's tedious, and therefore it's costly. It's all right for me, I have an army of technicians who sit in the sun with tweezers and glasses and magnifying glasses, or they winnow the soil and blow air across it. We've tried all sorts of techniques. These poor guys very patiently remove all the particulates they can see. It's also unpopular. Now, you said we had an ANU audience member? Yes. Yeah, some ANU staff criticised us a couple of years ago for separating the particulates in public, and the rural press got stuck into us. DPI methods underestimate true carbon stored by farmers in soils. And we were hammered and had to explain to the minister that we were doing this because particulates were different to humus. I think I'm going to win in the long run. We're going to have to get these particulates out. The bottom line, though, unfortunately, the trend remains. No matter what effort you put into removing the particulates, there are going to be fine roots, mycorrhiza, microbial biomass that do in fact vary during the year. You know that. Organic carbon is going to continue to vary within and between years and with season. One of our great white can mid-infrared technology distinguish between particulate and humus? Well, the first problem is that we have different opinions on what defines particulates. I've mentioned that briefly a few minutes ago. The literature's a little bit divided. We've got an Australian definition, but there are different definitions around the world of what particulate is. Worse still is definitions of what constitutes charcoal. There's a quote there from a guy called Schmidt. I think it's pretty obvious to most people in this room, when you burn organic material, what you get is going to depend on the temperature at which it's burnt, the rate at which it's burnt, the partial pressure of oxygen in the environment around which it's burning. Charcoal is not a single entity. There are lots of different sorts of charcoal. So when you try and calibrate a mid-infrared spectrum, there is more than one charcoal. So methodologically, are we there yet? My interpretation of the papers that I've read is that we still have a long way to travel before our notional pools match our measurable pools. So here's a few of my notional pools that you'll read about in the literature. Here are a few of the methods over there in column B, the methods we use. Now I'd like you all to tell me, if I point to any of these pools here, what methods do we use to define these notional pools? And I reckon there'd probably be 30 opinions in this room as to how we do that. So, do we just go along for the ride with the SCARP protocols? Or should we put a little more critical thought into the methods that we're using before we go into the paddock so we know what we're measuring? What happens when definitive methods are developed? Do we simply underplay the achievement of some poor, and I bet it's a young PhD student who sorts this out, do we underplay the achievement of that young chemist because, oh, we've already got methods that give us numbers? And there are some serious costs associated with carbon sequestration. As you can see from that data is after 25 years. No nitrogen, no carbon. How do we get the benefit of a pasture phase in my mixed farming systems? Remember, mixed farming is about 1/3 of the New South Wales land area. How do we get the benefit of the pasture phase in mixed farming if we can't have mineralisation of our organic matter to give us nitrogen during the cropping phase? We have to run down the carbon to get the legume nitrogen that we had in our pasture phase. It can't be done. We have to lose the carbon to get our nitrogen. Or what? We go for bag nitrogen? Has anyone done the calculations on the carbon cost of producing urea? Yes, it's being done. There is a huge energy cost in producing bag nitrogen. But what's worse? What's the cost of using bag nitrogen? A few academic lecturers in the room. As soon as you use bag nitrogen, of course, acidity raises its head. Now, how do we overcome acidity? We use limestone. Each tonne of limestone per hectare releases 440 kilograms of carbon dioxide, plus the mineralisation of any of the carbon in the soil, minus any net fixation of carbon from increased dry matter, which isn't mineralised when it's returned to the soil. This is yet another long-term trial. This is at Rutherglen. Again, as per the 1950s Australian literature, as the carbon in the soil increases, pH falls. If we're going to maintain our productive agriculture while sequestering carbon, we're going to have a couple of steps forward sequestering the carbon, then we're going to need to apply lime, which means we're going to take a couple of steps backwards in our carbon sequestration. I'm not going to cover things like 2D maps, profiles and variograms. I know that's going to annoy the Sydney Uni crew because they have an excellent record in spatial science and maths, and they have a lot to offer in the spatial resolution. But my focus here is on the time dimension. Just a quick review then. The long-term trends in carbon are slow. Year to year and within year variation is actually quite large. And you can't store carbon without nitrogen. And in fact, Clive Kirkby, whose work you might have read, has also shown that proteins in soil organic matter require sulphur and phosphorus. It's not just nitrogen. We have to tie up sulphur and phosphorus. Mixed farming relies on the end mineralisation built up during the pasture phase to produce grain during the cropping phase. And of course, the carbon and nitrogen cycles drive soil acidification, which requires liming to maintain productive agriculture, which releases CO2. We knew all this. None of this is new. Yes, that's my data, but nothing I've said can't be found in a textbook. Most of you will have learned it as undergraduates. We knew that soil carbon was hard to sequester. We knew it wasn't very accurately measurable. Did we believe that lots of funding from the federal government would turn up something new and wonderful? That we might be able to quantify soil organic carbon to the nearest dollar per hectare? Well, can we make any progress? Yes, we can. Going forward, it's time for soil science to make a contribution, but we've got to keep it away from politicians and catchy logos. My story, that's supposed to come up bit by bit, it all come up in one go. Oh well. My story is one of very sober expectations. My expectation of a large increase in soil organic carbon. I'm supposed to click at this point and the blue comes up and says, it might be slow. My expectation of a decreased atmospheric concentration of CO2, it might be minimal and it might be hard to measure. And my expectation of a stabilised global temperature, I'm calling that optimistic. And I'll be very keen to see the numbers that Todd Scott, on people voting out there, because everybody's got yes-no buttons, so I'll be interested to see what people believe. I think that unless we warn governments and public administrators and the public itself that carbon enthusiasts have created a high expectation relative to present available data, then we could start very poor as a soil science discipline. Worse, we might even look unneeded and maybe even ridiculed like the climate scientists have been through. We don't want our funding to disappear. I don't. I'm sitting on millions of dollars of this stuff. But the expectations are going to have to be more realistic. So how do we be relevant to governments and politicians? I, for one, am going to be visiting DAF in Canberra on the 8th of November. And I'm going to try and dampen their expectations because they happen to be rather high. I'm going to thank them for funding us. That's wonderful. It's good that they've funded science, and I very much appreciate what they've put in my pocket. But the expectations are going to have to be dampened. Our work is spectacular. I think the attempts to make it look spectacular have been embarrassing. We still need to work on carbon and acidity and salinity and phosphorus and erosion and heavy metals. There's lots of work for us to do. But these boom and bust cycles of funding don't address sustainability issues. It took me 20-odd years to get some of that carbon data. It's me, every year, with my soil corer out there collecting that year after year, every core, every plot. And Graham, my long-suffering TO, who's been alongside me, he actually started on that Satwaggle trial in 1979. So if there's any mistakes in the data, by the way, it's us. It's our own data. We collected that with our own hands for 20 years. They are sustainability long-term issues. So how do we make ourselves relevant to government, to industry, and to the general public? I have two very lame ideas, and again, they've come up instantly without me clicking on the animation buttons. But just as an aside, this, of course, is the top soil science society in Australia. This is the Riverina branch, one of our team bonding races up Mount Kosciuszko. I was obviously first, but most of the others are behind me. Two ideas. Politicians and senior public administrators like to launch big dollars initiatives. They also like outcomes, during their reign especially. One of the things I'm very bad at is the internal reporting, and yet it's a key to our relevance. When our heads of department or program leaders send that irky email for our monthly report to be deleted, we're going to have to start taking that very, very seriously. For those of you in the public sector, the next rounds of cuts are next Wednesday, Thursday. There won't be many survivors on this occasion. The next time we're asked for our monthly report, we've got to give them outcomes. What was the key message from that paper or that report? How was it relevant to government? What brownie points could the minister get? It's cynical, but it's real. We live in a democracy. They've got a 3-year time horizon. We've got a 20-year issue. We've got to feed them something. How is it relevant to government? How is it relevant to industry? How is it relevant to the general public? We've got to crawl, not to the funding body, but to the politicians and the public. We've got to feed them the outcomes of our work. We're very bad at that thing. Look at the medical fraternity. They're on the news every night, getting out there with, oh, we're all going to die of cancer, we're all going to die of geriatric-related diseases, we've all got kidney problems, we're all obese. They get the money, but they also get outcomes. We've got to start focusing on the outcomes. My second suggestion is constructive criticism. I've tended to find a lot of the Soil Science Society to be a bit of a boys' club. I know we've got a couple of ladies, but it's a bit of an old boys' club. I think the branch meetings of the Soil Science Society provide a relatively scare-free and friendly forum for us to start introducing a bit more critical review into our work and to present at soil science meetings and not regard them as nothing of no importance. This is a big chance for Sydney Uni, CSIRO, DPI, OH and Environment. Hang the Guernseys on the door, or in the case of the Riverina on the barbed wire fence. Get in there, put our lame ideas, our science, our dreams on the line in a relatively friendly audience and make use of Soil Science Society meetings to get some critical feedback. Now, when I say critical feedback, I mean constructive criticism, not petty. I went to the 1980 Soils Conference. The argument there could have been resolved very simply by a couple of key measurements. But there's ladies present in the room, so I'm not going to elaborate. But the ruler might provide a hint. So how to be relevant? Criticism, constructive criticism. It's up to us to provide the facts to the government. And what we don't know, it's up to us to do the experiments and provide the evidence. I think science is its own best defence, and I couldn't find who said that. Does anyone remember? It was one of those very famous cosmology science. I don't know if that's really a science, but it was a cosmologist who said it. There was another ancient saying, stone sharpens stone, scholar sharpens scholar. I think the ASSI provides a forum for collectively strengthening the discipline of soil science through critical review. And I think we need to be critical of our own work and the work of others in our society, but we need to do it constructively. When the next bandwagon arrives, are we going to go into a feeding frenzy? Or can we step back and critically evaluate what needs to be done? What can we deliver of value to the government, public, as opposed to the papers that accumulate in our CV? And I'm as guilty as anyone. I'm not criticising the people with dozens of papers because I'm one of them. I miss them, I go to pages. I'm as guilty as anybody. As scientists, I think we need to be particular about what we do. The data we display is going to have to be very well processed and stabilised. Our interpretation should not be overcooked. I think we need a critical soil science community, not an old boys club. So thank you for the public cleansing of my spleen. Thank you. I presume I've